Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 20 of On the Road with AutoTrader, where we make car stuff simple for Canadians. My name is Jodi Lai, and I'm AutoTrader's editor-in-chief.
And I am AutoTrader's road test editor, Dan Alika.
And what are we talking about today, Dan?
Demystifying EV range.
That's exactly correct.
Good guess.
Yeah, it's like you were prepared for this or something. So EV range, I feel like, is something that is really misunderstood by a lot of people, and it might be holding a lot of people back from making that switch. And I know, like, not everybody is ready for an EV yet, and that's totally understandable. But we think that there's so much misinformation out there about EV range, and we kind of want to demystify it for you. Just to make it a little bit less scary because, you know, Dan and I were once new to EVs and we used to also experience a lot of anxiety with range. And even now, after having so much experience driving EVs, we still get scared from time to time, right? Because you did that big test not too long ago.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is like, I have a hard time with it because I still think it's fair and relevant for people to be fearful. I think EVs are imperfect, but they're also the best solution we have at the moment. And all the eggs are in that basket anyways,
Exactly.
So you can't really go back.
And it's kind of whether you like it or not, that's just the way the industry
What do
is
I
going.
always say? You people who say, I won't buy an EV, I'm like, yeah, you will, because you're not going to have a choice.
You're not going to have a choice, especially because back in December, the Canadian government released their EV mandates for the next decade or so, right? And so basically, they said that by 2026, they're aiming that at least 20% of new vehicles sold will be EVs.
Now, I mean, I do think we need to demystify even this stuff, right? Is that these are targets. These aren't necessarily, mandates in terms of like the industry must meet these. Like if you take a look at Quebec, for example, it has a zero emission vehicle mandate where automakers must sell a certain percentage of zero emission vehicles. Otherwise they will pay penalties. Those are mandates in the sense that if they don't sell those vehicles, they are penalized. And it's like millions of dollars. These federal mandates are targets. So the federal government wants to see, these percentages reached on these timelines. But at least as of right now, there are no ramifications. And that is a problem because business in general, but the auto industry in particular, unless you hold automakers, collective feet to the fire, they will drag them until the bitter end. So it is in my opinion, it is the most toothless, it's very real. Climate change is real.
Absolutely.
We need to reduce emissions, but the government is taking this very toothless approach of like, well, we hope that we're going to sell this many vehicles by this time.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, you need to tell the auto industry, this is what's happening. You need to do it. Otherwise, the change is never going to happen.
And this is what will happen if you don't do it.
Yes,
I do think that accountability is very important. Like, even for myself, if I don't give myself a hard deadline to complete certain tasks by.
Like your reviews?
I'm very timely with my car reviews, thank you very much.
Because you set deadlines for yourself.
Exactly. And so I need those hard deadlines or else I'm just going to sit there on those car reviews and do nothing. Anyway, yeah, and so the mandates say that by 2035, they're hoping that 100% of new vehicle sales will be EVs. I think that is very ambitious. I don't know how successful that's going to be. As of right now, I don't think our infrastructure is good enough
it's terrible.
to support that at all. So there's a lot of work to be done to get there.
Yes, and we can demystify that as well. Again, even that target of 100%, as Jodi mentioned, that is new vehicle sales. So it's not as if the government is going to scrap every vehicle that's, parked in driveways across the country in 2035. No, you will still be able to buy used vehicles. It's just that the target is that automakers will no longer be able to sell new gas-powered passenger vehicles. So we're talking about the cars, trucks, and SUVs that you are going to buy, F-150s, Civics, CRVs, all of that stuff. The goal is for those to be zero emissions, but you are spot on. The infrastructure in this country is horrendous. We don't have enough. And yes, the government has, set up plans and programs to incentivize people both to install home chargers and to provide rebates for companies that install chargers, but there's not been very much info about those.
No.
And once again, it's just one more reason I think that people and companies are going to be slow to adopt because they don't know. There's a lack of education and awareness.
And that's why we're here.
Exactly.
And so explaining and demystifying EVs is something we do a lot. You know, people always ask us about EVs. And we love hearing your questions about them. So if you have any questions about EVs or anything like that, please email expert@trader.ca. We'll try to help you out. Zero judgment. You know, like I said, Dan and I were once new to EVs. But through our years of reviewing different EVs, driving them in different conditions, and we both live in buildings that don't have charging. And so we have to both rely on the public charging infrastructure, which gets us really grumpy
my
because it's not
God.
very good.
It's terrible. And that's another problem with it, right? Is that EVs. Look, I'm not trying to, for those of you listening out there, I'm not a sky is falling kind of guy when it comes to electrification, but it is a problem when, the let's say the main target or the earliest target buyers are, urban dwellers, most of whom live in buildings. And this has been coming down the pipeline for years. But again, just like automakers being slow to move, these massive construction companies are the same way. These developers are not just going to do it out of, the goods of their hearts, install EV chargers. But now you have all these condos that are still going up that have zero EV infrastructure.
Yeah, some of them do have it.
Or they have literally a smattering of spots.
There's let's say 1,000 units and there's 3 chargers. That's clearly not enough.
It just blows my mind, right? And it's that pass the buck, it's someone else's problem, but it's like, well, okay, you look at Toronto, right? You look at Liberty Village, you used to live there. It's nothing but condos. Even though it's very pedestrian friendly, I would say. It's not very transit friendly. People have to leave, to walk down to King Street or whatever, walk up to Queen to get on the streetcar. But it's a pedestrian friendly zone, but people still drive there like crazy. So many people own cars and there's nowhere to charge. None of these buildings have chargers in the spots.
None.
In their undergrounds.
Yeah.
And it's like, what good is that doing?
And that's the main thing that's personally holding me back from getting an EV is because I don't have a place to charge at home. It becomes very inconvenient because that means you have to carve out an hour in your schedule once. And because I drive so much, I would literally have to charge my car once a week. And I don't have time to sit there at a public charger for about an hour. And it's just, I don't like the experience. It's not convenient. Sometimes the public chargers aren't working. Sometimes they're not fast enough. It's just not a fun experience.
I showed up last week. Will and I were shooting the Kia Soul EV, and I showed up at this Petro-Canada charger that is pretty reliable. It's the one in Milton, just off the 401. It's pretty reliable. And I showed up. All of them were out of service.
That's so annoying.
And that was a new one for me. I've been to chargers before where there's 1 or 2 stations that are down. This was the entire band. Now, granted, there's only, I think it's 4 but still, the fact that I couldn't, because I wanted to hook up to a DC fast charger, I couldn't even get on a level 2. Not that that would do me any good. I couldn't sit there for 6 hours, but again, that's the problem with this. Now, Petro-Canada, to its credit, has been sort of ahead of the game when it comes to these gas stations, getting on board with electrification. The Canadian Tire gas stations are doing the same, but still, again, it's not good. It's not where we need to be headed.
If you can charge at home, an EV is almost a no-brainer. It's a very easy choice because it's very convenient. You plug it in when you go to bed, you wake up, you're at 100%, you're good to go. But the reason why I wanted to do this episode is because recently I was driving a Genesis G80 EV.
What a hilarious car that no one
Genesis, will buy it.
And Genesis
it's great,
didn't tell anyone about it.
I know.
It just arrived.
And it is a great car, which is a shame because, it's not in a popular body style.
No.
And so I worry that it's not going to be very popular, but it is great.
Wait, can we just remember how ahead of the game you were on that you went to Hyundai's headquarters in Markham to return a car? And then you saw it in like the camo and you were like, what the heck?
I was really excited about it actually,
I
because at
know.
that point they haven't even announced that there was going to be an electric G80.
But then it arrived on the market with no
It was very quiet.
fanfare.
Yeah.
And then I remember talking to someone at Genesis and they're like, oh yeah, no, it went on the market about 6 months ago. And I'm like, you didn't even tell me. And I'm an auto journalist. You would think like, but anyways.
But anyway, I was driving that car, and then my boyfriend was in the passenger seat, and then he randomly said, "Oh, do you want me to plug in your phone?" And I was like, "Why? My phone's fully charged." And he's like, "Oh, it says it only has 25%." I'm like, "Oh no, that's the car's battery." And then he like kind of panicked about it, and he was like, "Are we gonna make it home?" And I was really relaxed. I'm like, "Yeah, it's that means it has, about 125 kilometers. We're about 30 kilometers away from home. Like, we'll be totally fine." And I was very relaxed, and he was like scared.
But I get that.
I totally understand that.
Yeah.
And I think it's because a lot of people are used to like, cell phones or iPads being at 25% and then just instantly dying.
Well, it's also like that hilarious. I've said before that we need to change, the way we look at vehicles and driving when it comes to
100%.
electrification. But when you think about it, even now, right? You drive along the 401, it's wintertime. There are signs that say, like be winter prepared. Make sure, to keep your fuel tank topped up. And that's because, if there's an emergency, you want to make sure that you have lots of gas. Well, when it comes to electrification, those same warnings can't exist, but we've programmed our brains to think, hey, it's winter, I shouldn't have less than half a tank of gas. Well, you're guaranteed in an EV to drive with less than 50% charge. That's just it's going to
Yeah.
happen, right? And so again, we have to change the way that we look at vehicles and the way we look at driving when it comes to EVs, even when it comes to those, preparedness tips, because they just can't apply.
Yeah, and that's true. And the thing is with EVs is that there are certain safeguards that are built into those vehicles, so it won't just die on you like a phone would or like an iPad would.
Except ask my neighbor whose Tesla just died on them.
It happens from time to time, but it is extremely hard for it to get to that point where your car literally just turns into a brick.
Yes.
So that's kind of the first thing that I wanted to demystify is that EV cars don't really act like the tech we're used to that is powered by batteries, like our cell phones and such.
But also, it's not that there's a finite amount of range or an infinite amount of range. Like there's like if you get to 100%, yes, there are or 0%, yes, there are safeguards to keep it from, like essentially corrupting the battery, but it still won't drive. That I think is the problem. Forget, getting to that 0%. It's like what happens once you're there, right? It's not like you can walk. There was a guy I saw yesterday. His car, or 2 days ago, his car died. He walked up the street,
To get some gas, like
came
a jerry
back
can.
with a jerry can,
Yeah.
right? What's that? I said it before. You can't walk back with a bucket of electrons and just, dump them in. Like that's the reality of EVs.
Yeah, and if it gets to that point, it is rather inconvenient because you would have to get your car flatbedded to a charging station so that you could sit there and wait for it to charge. But despite all of that, I still think that there's a lot of just misunderstanding about EVs. And so like that's what we're going to try to kind of demystify today. Like there are clearly pros and cons to having an EV. That's not what we're here to demystify. We want
Yeah.
to talk about range because we know that that's like probably the most scary thing for a lot of Canadians who are kind of on the fence about making the switch. And so because we've both driven so many EVs, we've kind of learned to deal with that anxiety. And so we kind of want to share what we've learned, just so, you won't be so scared if you're thinking about making the jump.
I think one thing I can share that's kind of an obvious one, but only obvious to people with EV experience is that they do operate inherently differently than gas powered vehicles. So generally speaking, a gas powered vehicle burns less fuel on the highway than it does in the city, and with EVs it's the complete opposite. Generally, it has to do with the way that they slip through the air. Yes, they're designed to have low coefficient of drag and all that, but there's just it takes more energy to keep it moving at a constant rate. And then on top of that, when you add in that, wind resistance and all that, like it is
Yeah.
more, it's going to consume more.
And on the highway, you're not really using your regenerative braking as much as you would
Yeah.
in the city. So that's another thing to keep in mind is
Yeah,
that,
that stop and go
yeah,
traffic is just going to top up the battery a little bit here and there. It's incremental, but it does add up. Every time you slow down, if you're, just like feathering the throttle to come to a stop, it's going to spin that electric motor in reverse. It's going to put that kinetic energy that you would lose otherwise into the battery pack. So you're not going to see it, jump up. Like, let's say the drive to work normally burns 10%. It's not like you're going to arrive at work having burned nothing with regenerative braking engaged, but it'll keep that couple percent that you would have lost otherwise in the
yeah.
battery, and that does add up
I
over
mean,
time.
some EVs that I've driven will show you in kilometers how much battery you've recouped by coasting. So if I lift my foot off the throttle at the beginning of like an off ramp for a highway, and I coast to a stop at the stoplight, I'll get back like 1.5, 2 kilometers maybe. So it's small, but it does add up
Oh,
over
we can
time.
also demystify that, because something I see and hear a lot is people talk about the regenerative brakes. They're not the mechanical brakes. You're not using the mechanical brakes at all. It's regenerative braking. It literally is using the electric motors to bring the vehicle to a stop. So it has nothing to do with your brakes. It's also one of those things that you do need to be mindful of, that if you're using one pedal driving so much, that you might have to get your brakes serviced or replaced from lack of use, like your mechanical brakes, because a lot of EVs out there, you can drive them with only ever using the mechanical brakes to like shift in and out of park and reverse and stuff like
Yeah.
that. Well, if that's the case, you're never going to, brakes have that kind of like, you see after it rains, they get a little bit of rust build up and all that. Because the way that they work, it, it's going to go ahead and rub the brake pads on the face of those discs. So it slowly is going to like burn off that rust or rub off that rust. But if you're not doing that, yeah, regenerative braking can lead to. So you should use your mechanical brakes every once in a while in your EV.
Definitely, that is good advice. And so just stepping back a bit, when car manufacturers state a range, it's always an estimated range, and that's the same thing when they talk about fuel economy. It's estimated under
Yeah,
ideal
but
conditions, and it's always going to be different depending on your driving style, what you're using your EV for, the temperature outside, your wheel
let's be
size.
real, right? I agree with you wholeheartedly. But let's be real. The accuracy of fuel economy numbers, assuming you're not, stomping the gas pedal between every stoplight and just driving like a complete maniac, you can get pretty close.
Yeah,
Even on a super cold day with winter tires, if your car is rated for, I don't know, 8.7 liters per 100, it's like you're going to get something in the nines as a kind of worst case
yeah.
scenario in the wintertime. In an EV, you can lose 25, 30, 40% of the range. And that again is troubling, because that is really an estimate, whereas fuel economy is like, it's very scientific.
That's a good point. And so how automakers are responding to that is that these days a lot of EVs will now give you range estimates based on your past driving behavior, so that what you see is a lot more accurate. And they know that it differs from person to person and situation to situation. So that's something they're trying to do to help alleviate that cause of stress, which
Yeah.
I think is actually really useful.
But we can talk about that Chevy Bolt EUV experience I had, right? It's got 397 kilometers of range. When I picked it up, it was at like 413 or something. So it had a little bit more than it technically should. Again, because of that driving history, other people that had tested it had done well. I left with 100% range, door to door. The drive from my place to downtown London, Ontario is 175 kilometers. And I chose that not just because the beer in London is very good, shout out Beer Lab, but because I thought, okay, it's fair to expect 350 kilometers if it's got 412 kilometers of range.
Yeah.
That's reasonable, because when you look at the consumption, right, it was, I don't know, something like, let's say it was 22 kilowatt hours per 100
And it was a
kilometers.
cold day.
It was like, yeah, hovering around zero, little bit of rain, but I thought, okay, 175 kilometers each way, even on the highway, it should be able to do that. And when I got, so the drive to London, I was losing range at a rate of 2 to 1. So for every kilometer I drove, I was losing 2 kilometers of range.
And that's pretty scary.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
And again, you got to think, right? A lot of people that I see online, complaining and saying that they'll never own EVs, they're generally like, rural dwellers, right? People who live in the country. And I get that. This is making a drive. Okay, London's not in the GTA, but it's like close enough.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who commute from all around, Hamilton, Kitchener, Guelph, heading east, Oshawa, out to Peterborough. Those people are going to have that same problem that I had.
Yeah, especially if there's nowhere to charge at your destination.
Yeah.
That can be pretty stressful, and I
Yeah.
totally understand that. And so those concerns that people have about range are very real.
Yeah.
And the infrastructure really needs to be better to help alleviate those concerns.
I would have thought, honestly, that more of these gas station companies would have been like chomping at the bit. This is a business model that, it's an easy transition for them, right? They are going to, regardless of the fact that, yes, you will still be able to drive and buy used gas-powered vehicles, it's obviously these mandates are going to put a dent in their profit margins. So I would think that they would have been investing now.
Yeah,
To
to help
get out
future-proof themselves,
Yeah.
right?
Yet you look at, I hate to like throw shade, but you look at like Esso and Shell stations and all that.
Yeah.
There aren't very many that I've seen with EV infrastructure, whereas again, Petro-Canada has been sort
And
of ahead of the
Canadian
curve,
Tire.
and Canadian Tire. And that to me just defies logic, that the companies that have the physical real estate to be providing these solutions to have DC fast chargers installed are not getting out ahead of it.
Yeah, and it sucks because those gas stations already have the right amenities, right? Like
Yeah.
the worst thing for me is when I'm trying to charge an EV and there's like no lighting, so I'm sitting there in the dark by myself in a parking lot. Like I just don't feel, it's just not a very comfortable situation to
Yeah.
be in. There's no restaurants I can walk to get a snack or like whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like I think every single mall should have fast chargers,
Totally.
every single grocery
And
store.
honestly, like that is one of those things, and it's not, again, it's not just to throw shade at the gas stations. If you look at like Tesla was smart, right? Tesla said, hey, we're building these EVs. Our goal is to have obviously as many of them on the roads as we can. So Tesla went out in its earliest days and started working with these malls and all of these like public, places to say, hey, we want to put in these fast charging stations. So now you look at these shopping malls and they have these massive banks of Tesla superchargers. Sherway Gardens in Toronto is a great example, right? There's got to be, I don't know, at least a dozen Tesla superchargers. There are 2 flow stations on the property. One of them is a DC fast charger and one of them is a level 2. That's it.
Yeah. And I've gone to that mall many times hoping to charge, only to get there and see that someone else is already at the charger, which means I'm
I
out of
showed
luck.
up there on Saturday in that Soul EV, and there was some jerk in a Lexus RX parked in the spot, and I was like, that to me, that again, this apply whether you are soon to adopt an EV, whether you're considering it, or whether you hate the idea of EVs. Don't do, it's called icing people out of spots because you're parking your internal combustion engine vehicle. Don't do that. That's, to me, that's up there with like you parking in one of those spots that's designated for, young or pregnant mothers.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
It's just rude.
It's terrible, because the thing with those EV spots is there aren't, if I don't have another option, what am I supposed to do? You can park and walk into the mall. If I'm there because I need to charge, how am I supposed to get to the next closest charger? If I only have a few percent battery and I've come there and the app says, nope, there's no one parked there, and I show up and there's some jerk there in his gas-powered vehicle,
Yeah.
I am going to be very upset.
And that gets really stressful if you're at like 10%. Like if you don't have a lot of battery charge left and then you need enough range to go and drive to find another charger, and that's really stressful. So like please don't if you're not charging your vehicle, please don't park in the EV charging
This has
spots.
turned from demystifying range
To us just being grumpy.
to ranting about EVs and all the things that upset us.
But I mean, okay, so let's just go back to helping demystify
Okay.
it. So I've done a lot of like long road trips in EVs.
Yeah.
I've driven from Toronto to like Kingston, Toronto to Ottawa in an EV. And one of the tips I love to tell people is that if you're doing a longer road trip, there's a lot of fast charging along like the 401, the 400, all of those major highways, they have fast charging. The second tip I like to tell people is if you're looking for a hotel, any of those booking sites that you can use to book hotels will allow you to filter ones that have EV charging, and it's usually free. So you plug in your car at night, you wake up, you're
I'm
at a full
starting to
charge.
see it though, where it's like there's like a $10 premium per night for
That sucks.
when we just Jody and I were supposed to go to Montreal for the auto show, and the hotel that we had booked, there was a note that it was like, valet parking $35 a day, and then it had a little asterisk, and it was like $10 additional charge per night for electric vehicles.
So that's annoying. Usually when I've done it, it's been free. Like they'll just throw it in for free, but it's still an option for you. It's still convenient if you can plug it in overnight.
Absolutely. Because then you don't have to go out of your way again.
Exactly.
It's one of those things where if you can just do that one stop, hey, I'm at my hotel and I can charge, even if it's $10 extra a night, you're waking up with all kinds of peace of mind that when you need to leave the next day, you don't need to carve out that additional time to charge the vehicle.
Yeah, and that's always good. So I feel like we could talk about EV range forever because there's so many questions.
I haven't even looked at these notes because
I know.
we've just been...
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the floor to all of our listeners and viewers out there. If you have questions about EV range or EVs in general, just email us at expert@trader.ca, and we can compile all of your questions and kind of do it that way.
Can I also just say this is less of a demystification and more of a challenge? EV owners out there, I know a lot of you are great ambassadors for electrification, but there are just as many who aren't. If somebody comes to you to ask you about a Chevy Bolt or a Kia Soul and you drive a Tesla Model 3, like, just get off the high horse. You should be talking about the merits of electrification and not dunking on the car they're considering.
Yeah.
That to me is a huge problem. There's this kind of like,
Well, because not everyone can afford a Tesla Model 3.
Exactly. Or
not everyone wants one.
And
so
that to me is one of those things, like, you really do need to look at it as like, okay, you want to think of yourself as, doing the right thing for the environment, then it's not about brand loyalty. It's about loyalty to
the cause.
To the cause. So you should be doing that. And I remember that was a huge thing on Twitter, right? Where, Elon Musk said, oh, Tesla and Tesla's owners, we are going to, ensure that we're ambassadors for electrification.
Yeah.
And then you'd see all these Tesla owners that would just dunk on people who drive or were considering non-Tesla branded vehicles. And it's like, come on, man. Like, that's
not really helping anybody.
No, that's not like, you might feel better about yourself, but you kind of look mean. And you're discouraging people.
Something I've seen on Twitter is some people have very innocent questions like, oh, hey, how do you guys deal with range anxiety? And a Tesla owner will just be like, you don't get it if you have a Tesla. I'm like, that's not a helpful
It's also a
piece of
lie.
advice.
Like, I know a lot of Tesla owners will say, oh, I could drive from Toronto to Montreal, right? But it's like, okay, that's true and that's fair and it's great. But also, okay, well, now let's drive to Moncton, right? So it's like you can always move the goalposts and say, look, you will get range anxiety. So it's like, let's be helpful. Just because that's like me saying, well, I can, you go, oh, I can't reach that thing on that shelf. And it's like, well, I can, but there's going to be a shelf I can't reach, right?
Yeah.
So rather than make fun of you for not being able to reach that shelf. Why don't we think of a solution together,
Let's
right?
get a ladder and do it together.
So we need to like have a little bit more, unity in that front, because if people are going to adopt EVs, they need some guidance and they need some help. Be helpful. Don't be a jerk.
It really is a group effort between existing EV owners, the government, people, gas station companies. We really all have to work together to make this thing a reality. And that's something that I think needs to get better. But anyway, we have a very fun story today in our Ask an Expert.
Ooh.
It's not a question. It's a fun story.
I like that.
It's from Matthew Lentini of Toronto.
Okay.
It's actually a story about a van. Maybe you should read it because you're such a big van fan.
Van time.
Yeah.
Look at my shirt. It says Vans. Okay, it's the shoe company, but still, that's kind of funny.
Dan loves vans. He's a big advocate for vans.
Speaking of vans and electrification, if the Volkswagen ID Buzz is as good as I think it's going to be,
You gonna buy it?
I will buy one.
Yeah.
I currently drive a diesel-powered Golf wagon. I love it to pieces. I don't want to get rid of it, but if I'm thinking electrification, that thing, if you guys haven't seen it, go to autotrader.ca/editorial, pop it into the search bar there, and take a look. We've got photos and some stories about it. It's so cool. It's like retro, futuristic, so neat. I love it. Love
and
a
it's
good
gonna
van.
have lots of range. It looks cute. Like even all my friends who don't care about cars are flipping out about this van because it looks so cool.
Okay, speaking of vans, here we go. This is from Matthew, my boy Matt. In 2008, my brother and I bought a 1964 Dodge van. So cool, and it kind of looks like the ID Buzz. It's like a flat front.
Yeah, it's like a bread loaf van.
Oh, love it. That was like very similar. If you guys know the Mystery Machine from Scooby-Doo,
Yes.
that's, yeah. It only cost us a few $100 because it wasn't running, but after swapping a very few inexpensive and simple parts, we got it going in no time. We did some light body work, hastily disguised our shoddy labor under a rattle can paint job, and then tossed a bunch of vintage car parts into the back, along with a few boxes of car and motorcycle culture t-shirts that I had designed, and then hauled it all the way to the Rumblers show under the BQE in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. If you guys don't know, it's a very cool, market. I really like where this story is going.
I knew you'd like this one.
We had absolutely no plans to sell the van, but some guys offered us a few grand in cash, so we sold it on the spot. We didn't really have a way home, but who cares? He was a young dad, and I was a starving artist. We needed the money. They drove it home, leaving us stranded, each with a fistful of dollars in one hand, a skateboard in the other, and a big grin. I can't say that word, but we packed the remaining unsold car parts into some plastic crates we found outside of a grocery store, threw it all on top of our skateboards, and pushed everything to the subway, which took us to the train station so that my brother could take everything back to his bungalow on the south shore of Long Island. After shoving everything into the train, we parted ways, and I skated home to my apartment in Queens. So cool.
What a fun story.
I love that. Vans, see, that's the thing, right? There's always something good when vans are involved.
I mean, that's such a fun story, You sell your van not planning to, and you got a skateboard home. I feel like that story is something that could have happened to you.
I love it.
Yeah.
Matt, thanks for sharing that story, man.
Thank you so much for sharing
And
that
thanks for
story.
listening. Thanks to everyone else for listening. Like Jodi said, if you got a question, if you got a rant, if you don't like what I said about your role as an ambassador, email us at expert@trader.ca. Tune in next week when we talk about, what are we talking about?
Next week, we're talking about, what's the deal with all these new EV companies?
Wow.
So we're
More EV talk.
More EV talk because it's a hot button issue right now.
It really is. All right, until then, we'll see you guys.